Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video we're gonna talk about locking out pieces in chess, and this is all part of a bigger playlist which I'm trying to assemble, so a bigger video series in general about strategic play in chess, which is often taught in a very complicated manner, but in this video series I'm trying to make it as comprehensive as possible and as easy to understand by breaking down the, at least in my opinion, main things that most people struggle with from a strategical point. In this chapter we're talking about locking out pieces, so what I would understand from that is that we're trying to restrict the opponent's pieces, usually with pawns, so that they can not fulfill their wanted function. So we're trying to box them in basically so that they cannot take part in the game as much as they would like to. This first example is a game played between Winter and Capablanca. Jose Raul Capablanca, the third world champion from Cuba, had the black pieces here. And we see now black is struggling with this pin here. It's quite unpleasant. White could threaten to take on f6, ruining our pawn structure. And that's why Capablanca played g5, the only real move here for black. But he had to see something pretty important, because in these positions with g5, knight takes g5 basically always has to be considered. Because if black were to take back with the pawn, then bishop takes g5, and again this pin is very unpleasant, and now we don't even have the pawn on g7 protecting the knight on f6. So now bishop e7 would be forced, knight takes d5 would simply lose the queen, and after knight e7, queen e7, queen f3, king g7 is forced, protecting the knight on f6, but queen g3, and this position is almost hopeless for black. The king is very weak. Now f4 will come, even bringing the rook on f1 into the game, and yeah, with a very, very dangerous attack. You could usually say that opposite colored bishops, which we have here, usually benefits the attacker, because the opposite colored bishops are not easy to exchange for each other, and exchanges are obviously good for the defending side and bad for the attacking side, because the attacking side wants to have as much material to attack the opponent's king as possible. But after knight takes g5, knight takes d5 is the solution, and yeah, we're not taking the knight on g5 but on d5, and white doesn't have any discoveries here. He could retreat the knight back to f3, but after knight e7 we are solving both problems. First the queen hanging here and the knight hanging on d5, and now this pin is still there, but with the knight being on e7 it's not as dangerous anymore. Yeah, this knight on e7 is simply protected twice. That's more than enough. So knight takes d5 is the refutation of knight g5, but still very important to see when you play g5. So Winter was forced to take on f6 and then retreat the bishop. I mean, he could also do it first, but then after knight takes d5, he takes d5. Black could just consolidate his center by something like f6. And now also this bishop on g3 is pretty much out of the game. Pawn on d5 could become weak at some point, and we have the bishop pair. Bishop could find a nice square on g4, pinning white's queen here, and the knight on f3. So understandably, he took the knight on f6, queen f6, and now he went bishop g3. And now a very important moment. I'm sure that Capablanca already saw what he was about to do when he played g5, but it's actually a nice little exercise. So if you want to think for a little moment what's the best move here for black, now's the time to do so. I will tell you now, which is bishop g4 is the way, and we want to pin this knight and the queen, and the point is that after h3 black could theoretically go back, but that was not the plan. Capablanca wanted to take and go into this endgame. And now if you think about it, now we will see that the bishop on g3 is actually just a pawn. Like, he cannot go out of this box because the pawn on f2 takes the square from him, and yeah, the bishop can never come out anymore. Could play f4, but then we will simply take, and he loses a pawn, and his bishop has to go to h2, which is also not much better. So I'm sure this was Capablanca's grand plan after all, to have the bishop boxed in here on g3, and I think that's a perfect example for this whole strategic concept in general for locking out pieces. So here he simply went f6 and consolidating the center here, and now white is basically without any real plan. He has to somehow try to keep the position closed on the queen side, otherwise if the position opens up on the queen side, black is basically a piece up there, because the bishop on g3 simply doesn't do much there. So he played f6, king g2, and now a5, and all of this can be explained by the saying that you should always play on that side where you're stronger, and in this case it's definitely the queen side, because there we are up this extra bishop. For example, here it wouldn't make sense to do anything on the king side, because there white anyway has this piece here, so it won't be possible to start an attack there, for example. So black has to play on the queen side here. He played a5 with the idea to gain space here. White blocked it with a4, and now simply king f7, and Capablanca brought the king to e6. In general, you should always activate the king in the endgame as long as it's safe. He played king e6, white played h4, and now it's simply important to ignore this. If you were to take, then rook takes h4, pawn on h6 would become weak, and also white could finally free his bishop with f4 when he can finally breathe again, so that would be a huge mistake. Capablanca went rook b8, and now his point is to somehow prepare b5, preferably with c6 first, so that after b5, if white captures, you can take back with the pawn. White took on g5, h takes g5, and still, yeah, this bishop on g3, this whole operation with h4 didn't do much. Bishop on g3 is still totally locked out. b3, c6, rook a2, and b5. That is what Capablanca has planned. Now white played rook a1, again, trying to stay solid as much as possible, and now he might be threatening to take here, and we cannot recapture anymore with the pawn, because then the pawn on a5 would fall. But here Capablanca found the way to break through, which is c4. So he's trying to open up everything, even with the cost of a pawn. Simply now opening up his bishop. The bishop could come via c5 to d4, and that's kind of the breakthrough here. White could potentially take here and win this pawn, but now our rooks are activated. For example, rook b4, we will gain back the pawn on c4 and slowly win, because again, white is basically down a bishop here. White decided to take on b5, but now this very important intermediate move, c takes b3, and after c takes b3, only now rook takes b5. And yeah, now the pawn on b3 is a weakness. Black only has to be careful to keep one pawn here, because if all of these 4 pawns would exchange, then it would probably not be enough for black to win, but as long as there's some play here on the queen side, there will always be big winning chances for black. White played rook a4, and black played rook takes b3, and yeah, rook takes a5 would simply fail due to now taking on d3, and now this perfect last position. Yeah, still the bishop is on g3, the same place where it was, I don't know how many moves ago, and now this c-pawn will simply decide the game, because black is just a bishop up here on this side of the board. White played d4 for desperation, but after rook b5, rook c4, rook b4, something similar happened. Now we even have the a-pawn, and white already resigned. So yeah, this was the first, I think, a very, very good example of how to lock out pieces and the potential dangers of it behind it. As we saw now, like here, the bishop was on g3, and it was almost 20 moves later, the bishop was still on g3, basically doing nothing at all.